There are certain things that only begin to make sense when you step far enough away to see them as part of a larger pattern. On its own, a single death certificate means almost nothing. A name written in a ledger means very little. A signature at the bottom of a coroner's report is just another line of ink unless that same name appears again, a broken bar and again, a broken bar and again. For 30 years, through dozens of deaths spread across 3 different counties through wars, epidemics, and fires that should have destroyed any clear trail, one particular name kept appearing exactly where it had no reason to be. The name never belonged to the deceased. It wasn't listed as a witness either. It was simply there, present, authorized, signed, and somehow, no one noticed. Not for 30 years. Because the safest way to hide a secret isn't to conceal it completely. The safest way is to make it look like ordinary paperwork. This is the story of Harrow County, Kentucky, and the name that should have disappeared long before it finally did. Before we continue with the story of Harrow County, welcome if you're new here. This channel is dedicated to stories just like this and near true accounts that are strange, unsettling, and difficult to explain. If that sounds like something you enjoy, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. What city? What state? I always like knowing who's out there in the dark with me. Harrow County's seat of government was a small, unremarkable settlement tucked into the eastern hills of Kentucky. The town sat where 2 creeks met, surrounded by ridgelines that seemed to keep both storms and the outside world at a distance. By the spring of 1847, the town had no more than 400 permanent residents. There were 2 churches representing rival denominations, both sharing the same graveyard while refusing to acknowledge one another. There was a dry goods store, a slow-turning mill that struggled during dry summers, and a courthouse that served several roles at once. On different days it could be a town meeting hall, a temporary place of worship, or occasionally an actual courtroom. The county itself was relatively new. It had been officially organized only 12 years earlier, carved from territory that had already been divided and redivided multiple times since Kentucky became a state. Its record-keeping reflected that history. The man responsible for maintaining those records was the county clerk, Hector Vane. He had held the position since the county was formed, and he managed the office with a curious mix of care and complacency, the kind that comes from knowing that no one is likely to examine your work too closely. In 1847, Vane was 51 years old. He wasn't particularly tall, but he was broad-shouldered and thick through the middle, the kind of build that hinted at a younger life of hard labor that had since softened with age. His face was round and flushed, his hair thinning and carefully combed across the top of his head. When he spoke, he did so slowly, as though each word had to travel a long distance before reaching his mouth. Yet his handwriting told a different story. It was remarkably neat and precise, upright lettering with long, elegant descenders. The writing looked almost delicate compared to the man who produced it. In time, that handwriting would become the most recognizable thing about Hector Vane. More recognizable, in fact, than his face. The Harrow County death ledger for 1847 begins in a completely ordinary way. 9 entries appear in January, most of them elderly residents. The listed causes of death reflect the vague medical language of the era: inflammation of the lungs, dropsy, wasting sickness. Each entry includes the signature of the attending physician when one was available, followed by the counter-signature of the county clerk. Hector Vane's name appears 9 times in January, 13 times in February, 11 times in March. This was perfectly normal. As county clerk, Vane was expected to sign these records. He had been doing so for 12 years without drawing any attention. What no one noticed, or at least not at the time here, was that Vane's name was also appearing in places where a county clerk had no real reason to be. In April of 1847, a farmer named Robert Ferris died on his property about 4 miles east of the county seat. The official cause of death was recorded as a fall from a horse. The attending physician was Dr. Clarence Lott, a young doctor who had graduated from a medical college in Ohio only 2 years earlier. He had come to Harrow County hoping to build a practice and had managed to do so largely because the previous local doctor had died the winter before from an illness Lott later described in the records as a complaint I cannot identify from the notes. Robert Ferris's death seemed unremarkable. He was 54 years old, left behind a wife and 4 children, and owed a considerable sum to the town's dry goods store. But at the bottom of the report beneath Dr. Lott's signature there was an additional line written in that precise handwriting, verified and recorded, H. Vane, County Clerk, present at examination of remains. That notation was unusual. County clerks were not expected to attend examinations of the dead. Their responsibilities were administrative, collecting reports, maintaining the ledger, and applying the county seal when necessary. Nothing in Kentucky's statutes required or even suggested that a county clerk should travel miles into the countryside simply to stand by while a doctor inspected a body. Years later, when Dr. Lott was asked about the incident, he admitted that it had struck him as strange even then, but he hadn't questioned it. According to Lott, Hector Vane had arrived at the Ferris property before the doctor himself had even been called. Vane introduced himself politely and explained that county policy required the clerk's presence whenever an estate of significant value might be involved. After that, he remained quietly in the corner of the barn while Lott examined the body. He asked no questions. He touched nothing. When the examination was finished, Vane simply nodded, made a note in a small leather-bound book he carried with him, and left. I didn't think much of it at the time, Lott would later say. He seemed to know what he was doing. Later that same year, in the autumn of 1847, another member of the Ferris family died. Martin Ferris, Robert's eldest son, was 22 years old. The cause of death was recorded as fever of the brain. And once again, at the bottom of the report, appeared the same neat signature, H. Vane, County Clerk, present at examination. 2 Ferris deaths within 6 months. Hector Vane present at both. Within 18 months, the Ferris property, once the largest privately owned tract of farmland in that part of the county, had passed completely into the hands of creditors. The widow remarried. The younger children eventually scattered. The land itself was sold at auction for a price far below its assessed value. The buyer was a land company whose articles of incorporation had been filed with the Harrow County Clerk's office just 4 months before Robert Ferris's fatal fall. The clerk who processed that incorporation paperwork was Hector Vane. But none of this looked suspicious when viewed inside a single ledger. And it certainly didn't stand out when confined to a single year. Patterns like this only reveal themselves over long stretches of time, decades. And the only way anyone could have recognized that pattern was by examining every record together and by actively looking for something unusual. At the time, no one was. The years between 1848 and 1855 were turbulent ones, both in Kentucky and across the country. The Mexican-American War had recently ended, sending many young men back home from foreign battlefields with habits and expectations that didn't always fit easily into quiet rural life. Meanwhile, the national debate over slavery, along simmering beneath the surface, was beginning to intensify. Kentucky existed uneasily between 2 worlds. As a border state, it never fully committed to either side of the growing divide, and that uncertainty settled into everyday life like dampness soaking into old wood. Amid all of this, Hector Vane continued his work. In 1848, he was re-elected county clerk without opposition. The position offered little pay and a great deal of responsibility, and few people were interested in taking it. He was elected again in 1852, and the records continued to grow. By this point, his tenure had lasted long enough that people had simply stopped thinking of the county clerk's office as something separate from the man who occupied it. Vane was the records. He was the ledgers, the land deeds, the incorporation filings, the death registers, the marriage licenses, the tax rolls. He was the living institutional memory of Harrow County. And he cultivated this impression with quiet, relentless care. He knew things about people. This was in itself unremarkable. Clerks always know things about people because the records they maintain are an archive of every legally significant moment in a community's life. But Vane knew things specifically, and he deployed this knowledge with a precision that was to anyone who thought about it clearly slightly unnerving. He would mention in casual conversation a detail from a deed filed 15 years before. He would know without being told that a man's father had died intestate, and that there were therefore questions about the inheritance that had never been formally resolved. He would know who owed whom and by how much, and since when. People found this impressive rather than troubling. It seemed like evidence of his dedication, his thoroughness, his care for the county and its citizens. It took a particular kind of mind to see it differently, to look at that encyclopedic memory, and ask not why does he know so much, but what is he doing with it. In the spring of 1851, a farmer named Alton Greer died of what was recorded as inflammation of the stomach. He was 63 years old, a widower with one surviving child, a daughter Margaret, 28, unmarried, who lived with him on the family property. The property was substantial, 240 acres of bottomland along the eastern creek, well-watered and productive, assessed at nearly 3 times the value of most comparable tracts in the county. Doctoral attended the death of Alton Greer. Hector Vane was again present at the examination of remains. His notation in the ledger was identical to the one he had made in 1847, verified and recorded H. Vane, county clerk, present at examination of remains. Margaret Greer, when she came to the courthouse 6 weeks after her father's death to file the estate paperwork, found that several things were already in order. The will, which she had never seen executed in its final form, had been filed with the county clerk's office 2 years before her father's death. It left the property to her outright, which she had expected, but it also stipulated that if she died or sold the property within 10 years, the proceeds should be divided between a list of charitable organizations. She recognized none of the organizations on the list. Neither did anyone else in Harrow County. When she asked Vane about this, he was helpful, patient, and deeply unhelpful. He showed her the document. He showed her the filing date. He confirmed her father's signature. He explained at some length the legal provisions for charitable bequests under Kentucky law. He expressed his sympathy for her loss. What he did not explain was how the charitable organizations listed in the will, 4 of them, had all been incorporated through the Harrow County Clerk's office within the last 8 years, or that the named agent for each organization was a different man in each case, none of whom lived in Harrow County, but all of whose names appeared in the clerk's records in connection with land transactions that had over the previous decade significantly expanded the holdings of a single privately held land company, the same one that had purchased the Ferris property. Margaret Greer never sold. She worked the land herself, hired 2 men from the neighboring county, and built a life there that she had not expected to be building alone. She was sharp and capable and quietly furious in the way that people are when they have understood that something is wrong, but cannot articulate exactly what. She watched Vane. She filed her taxes on time and in person so that she could watch him. She noted his habits, his hours, his visitors. She said nothing to anyone because she had nothing concrete to say, and because she was a woman alone on a piece of land that several powerful interests had already demonstrated they wanted, and she understood that speaking without proof is not courage, it is exposure. She was still watching in 1855 when the 3rd member of the Ferris family, Robert Ferris's 2nd son, James, who had returned to the county after several years away, was found dead in the creek at the eastern edge of what had once been the family property. The cause was listed as drowning. Hector Vane was present at the examination of remains. By that point, Vane's name had appeared on the death records of 11 Harrow County residents over 8 years. 11. His precise handwriting at the bottom of each report, that same notation verified and recorded, H. Vane County Clerk present at examination. And behind each of those 11 deaths, if you looked, really looked through the land records and the incorporation filings and the will contests and the tax assessments was a transaction. Property moved. Money changed hands in directions that were not obvious. Old claims were satisfied and new ones quietly established. Margaret Greer was 42 years old in 1855. She had a small leather-bound book of her own by then, in which he had been writing down what she had observed. Not accusations, not theories, just dates, names, and facts. The kind of record that a county clerk would recognize. She was waiting for the right person to show it to. She would wait 13 more years. The Louisville and Nashville Railroad reached Harrow County in the autumn of 1863 in the middle of a war that had torn the state in half without quite making it fall. Kentucky had declared its neutrality and then watched that neutrality be violated by both sides in turn. Confederate troops moving north across its southern border and Union forces responding from the river towns, and the people of the interior counties had learned to hold very still and say very little and wait to see whose army was closest on any given morning. The railroad changed things. It always did. It brought commerce and strangers and the particular anxiety of connection. The sudden awareness among people who had lived for a generation in a world bounded by ridge and creek that the rest of the country was very close and getting closer. Among the strangers the railroad brought to Harrow County was a man named Thomas Reed. Reed was 34 years old, lean and fair with the kind of precise, careful manner that suggested either a legal education or a very good approximation of one. He was in fact a journalist, a correspondent for a Louisville paper called the Evening Chronicle, which was at that point attempting to distinguish itself from its competitors by covering not just the war, but the home front, the economic disruptions, the land disputes, the community fractures that the war was widening, but that had begun long before the first shot was fired. Reed had been sent to Harrow County on what his editor described with some skepticism as a land story. There had been complaints filed with the state land office, irregularities and property transfers across several counties in the eastern hill country, patterns that suggested something more systematic than simple opportunism. His editor did not believe there was much to it. Reed had 2 weeks. He arrived on a Tuesday in October 1863 in a county that was simultaneously trying to manage the ordinary business of civilian life and the extraordinary disruptions of a war that had emptied it of most of its young men. He found lodging at the inn, asked around about who knew the county history, and was directed by 3 separate people to Margaret Greer. The first time Reed visited her property, she stood in the doorway and looked at him for a long moment before saying anything. She was by then 50 years old. She had the look of a woman who had been waiting for something for a very long time and had not yet decided whether what had finally arrived was it. "You're from the newspaper," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "You're looking into land records." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him a moment longer, then stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I have been waiting for someone to come in for 8 years." What Margaret Greer showed Thomas Reed that afternoon was not the leather-bound book. Not immediately. She understood with the instinct of someone who had been holding a secret carefully for a long time, that the most important thing was not to give it all at once. She told him about her father, about the will with the charitable organization she had never recognized, about the Ferris family, father and son, and then the younger boy in the creek. She spoke quietly and without visible emotion, the way you speak about facts rather than grievances, because she had known from the beginning that grievances could be dismissed, and facts could not. Reed listened. He had a reporter's way of listening. Very still, very focused, with occasional small questions that pulled the thread a little further without tugging hard enough to break it. "How many deaths?" he asked when she had finished the main body of what she had to say. 11 that I know of between 1847 and 1855, she said. "I stopped counting. I stopped being able to count with certainty because after 1855, he became more careful. The notation stopped appearing in the records. Reed looked up from his notes. He stopped signing himself as present. He stopped leaving a written record of his presence. That is not the same thing. Reed sat with it for a moment. What changed in 1855? Margaret Greer was quiet for a beat that was slightly too long to be simply thoughtful. I began asking questions in public, she said. Not about him specifically, about the charitable organizations in my father's will. I wrote letters to the state capitol. I asked about their legal standing. She looked at her hands. 2 weeks after I sent the first letter, the fence on the south edge of my property was broken in 3 places. My hired men found my dog dead in the morning. It was winter. There had been a snow and there were boot prints in the snow that were not mine and not theirs. Reed wrote this down, and then he said, and then I stopped asking questions in public, she said. But I did not stop watching. What she had been watching in the years since 1855 was a change in method. The death notations had stopped, but the pattern had not. It had simply become less visible. The land transfers continued, quieter now, routed through intermediaries, sometimes involving properties in neighboring counties where Vane's name had no formal standing. The charitable organizations had been dissolved one by one, and replaced with others. The land company had restructured twice, changing its name and its principles each time, while remaining in substance the same entity. She had tracked all of it, not because she was certain she was right, but because she was certain enough that she could not stop. And Vane, Reed said. How old is he now? 67, she said. Still clerk. He has been clerk for 28 years. Reed looked down at his notes. Then he looked up. Why hasn't anyone else seen this? Margaret Greer looked at him with something that was not quite contempt and not quite pity. The look of someone who has asked themselves the same question many times and found the answer each time both perfectly obvious and deeply insufficient. Because the records are his, she said, and because he is very good at his work. Before we go any further, I want to say this. The people who piece together the truth in stories like this one are never the powerful ones. They're always the ones who were told to be quiet and didn't quite manage it. If that kind of story speaks to you, this channel has many more. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment. I want to know what you think is really going on here. Do you trust Margaret Greer? Do you think Thomas Reed is in over his head? Thomas Reed spent the next 11 days in Harrow County. He slept 4 hours a night and the rest of the time he read. The clerk's office opened at 7 o'clock in the morning. Reed was on the steps at 6:45. And he remained there in the small room that smelled of old paper and tallow for as many hours as Vane would permit, which was, to Reed's slight surprise, nearly all of them. Vane did not obstruct him. He was cooperative, patient, and helpful in the deliberate way of a man who has decided that cooperation is the correct strategy. He answered questions readily. He retrieved ledgers without complaint. He offered context and historical background with the ease of a man who has spent 30 years in the same room. You have been clerk for a long time, Reed said on the second morning. 28 years. Vane agreed without any particular inflection. He was standing at a shelf replacing a ledger. His back was to Reed. The county has not produced many candidates for the office. Do you enjoy the work? Vane turned and looked at him. Margaret Greer was 57 in 1870. She had kept her property. She had kept her father's land and worked it herself and hired her men and paid her taxes and attended the courthouse when she needed to and watched Hector Vane from across the room with eyes that saw everything and said nothing for 13 years until Thomas Reed had sat across from her in her front room and she had decided the time was right. She was asked by Reed in the last of his interviews with her whether she felt that justice had been served. She was quiet for a moment in the way she was always quiet before saying something that mattered. The land is in receivership, she said. Some of the people who profited from this are facing proceedings. The record has been corrected as much as it can be corrected. She paused. But the men who lost their property are still dead. The families who were scattered are still scattered. The families who were displaced from land that had been in their names for a generation, some of them haven't been found, and the records from the other counties are gone. So, no, Reed said. I did not say no, she said. I said, "What happened?" "Justice is not my word for what we have. What we have is a corrected ledger. It is less than justice and more than nothing, and that is the most honest accounting I can give." Reed wrote that down. He used it in his final piece without attribution because she had asked him not to name her in the final article. She had spent 30 years watching from a safe distance, and she was not ready quite yet to be visible in the way that final naming would require. He respected this. He had learned over 7 years to respect the careful distances that people maintain when the thing they are watching is still capable of turning around. The Harrow County Courthouse was rebuilt in 1874 following a fire that began in the annex where old records were stored. The fire was attributed after a brief investigation to an overturned oil lamp. The records destroyed in the fire were for the most part duplicates of documents that had already been entered into evidence in the Attorney General's investigation. Nothing essential was lost, or so the investigation concluded. Thomas Reed, by then a senior editor at the Evening Chronicle, received a letter about the fire from Eliza Dorn, who had continued covering the story from Cincinnati with the steady determination she had brought to it from the beginning. Her letter was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph reported the fire. The second noted that the investigation had been conducted by the current county clerk and had concluded in 5 days. The third paragraph contained a single sentence. The current county clerk was appointed in 1868. The year Vane retired. He was trained in record-keeping by Hector Vane personally. Reed put the letter on his desk and looked at it for a long time. Then he wrote back to Dawn. "I know," he wrote, "I have known for 2 years. I have been trying to determine how much of the old pattern transferred with the training." Her response arrived 10 days later. "Enough," she wrote. "I don't know yet how much more than enough, but enough." In the autumn of 1877, a deed researcher named August R.W.S. was contracted by a Philadelphia investment firm to conduct a title search on a large parcel of Kentucky land that the firm was considering for purchase. The parcel was in Harrow County, one of the last significant tracts of the trust's former holdings that had not yet been fully adjudicated through the receiver-hip process. Rolls was a meticulous man. He had been doing title research for 18 years. And he approached the Harrow County records with the systematic attention of someone who had learned early in his career that the most important things in a title chain are often the things that don't quite fit. The gap in a date sequence, the correction that has been corrected, the signature that appears where it shouldn't or doesn't appear where it should. He spent 3 weeks in the courthouse. He found the pattern. Not Vane's pattern. Vane was dead. Had been dead for 6 years. The pattern Rolls found was newer, subtler, and in some ways more carefully constructed. It bore the marks of someone who had learned from the previous iterations. Mistakes from the visibility of Vane's personal presence in the death records, from the letter that had survived from the network of connections that had ultimately been traceable. This new pattern was more diffuse. The name that appeared in the records was not one name, but several, rotating, overlapping, each individual involvement seeming unremarkable in isolation. But RS was looking for patterns, not individual transactions. And what he saw laid out across the ledgers of the previous 8 years was the same underlying logic. Deaths followed by transfers. Transfers followed by consolidation. Consolidation following a line that pointed faintly but clearly toward the same end. He wrote a report for his Philadelphia client and recommended against the purchase. The client declined the purchase. Rules then wrote a separate letter not to the Evening Chronicle, whose coverage of the original story he had read carefully before coming to Harrow County, but to Thomas Reed personally, whose name he had found in the masthead, and whom he addressed with the directness of one professional to another. "You should know that whatever was happening in this county has not stopped. It has changed shape. It is harder to see and harder to prove, but the logic of it is the same. I believe you will recognize what I have found." He enclosed a 20-page summary of his title research. Read it on a Thursday morning in October of 1877. He read it twice. He took it home and read it a third time in the evening by lamplight in the room where he had spent 12 years writing about Harrow County and the people who had shaped it and the records they had kept and altered and managed. He recognized what RS had found. He recognized it the way you recognize the handwriting of someone you have never met, but whose letters you have been reading for 30 years. Not the letters themselves, because those had changed, but the hand behind them. The logic behind the hand, the particular way that a certain kind of mind organizes the world into something that looks from any single angle, like nothing more than ordinary paperwork. He was 58 years old. He had spent 15 years on this story. He sat for a long time in the lamplight. Then he wrote 2 letters. The first was to August R.W.S. asking him to continue his research and to document everything with the same rigor he had already demonstrated. The second was to Eliza Dawn, who was still at the Western Intelligencer in Cincinnati, who had never stopped watching, who had predicted 2 years before that there was enough of the old pattern left to grow back if the conditions were right. "You were right," he wrote. "It started again or it never stopped. I cannot yet tell which." The second investigation into Harrow County began in 1878. It was slower and quieter than the first, partly because the principals had learned from the first investigation, and partly because the men conducting it, Reed and Dornan Rolls, working without the formal apparatus of a lawsuit or an attorney general's office, had only the tools of documentation and publication, which were formidable, but not unlimited. By the spring of 1879, they had assembled enough to publish. Reed's final article on Harrow County appeared in the Evening Chronicle on the 14th of April, 1879. It was titled "With the Particular Weight of a Man Who Had Been Working Toward This Sentence for 30 Years." The name changed, the system did not. The article documented the second iteration of the pattern, the 8 years of quiet activity following Vane's retirement and death, the new network of names, the same underlying logic of deaths and transfers and managed records. It named the current county clerk. It named 2 associated landholders. It named the firm in Louisville that had served without apparent awareness as the financial conduit.